Well, first of all, thanks to the Organization for Human Rights for giving me the opportunity to speak, and I think most importantly, be able to listen to very thoughtful colleagues making very, very strong points about the situation in the United Arab Emirates. As Ibrahim has said, Khalid Ibrahim has said, it really is quite shocking what we here in the UK and in Washington and elsewhere in the West, what we call the free world, are allowing to happen. Co-conspirators, really, one could argue. One of the things that I have been thinking about for some time is the definition of patriotism. You know, there is in Donald Trump's worldview, the idea that the people who stormed the Capitol are patriots. In fact, he's even suggested that should he regain the presidency, he will pardon them. In the Gulf states, in the UAE, there's a kind of military idea of what patriots are. And a patriot is someone who doesn't challenge, doesn't question, supports the government line, views those who do question as traitors, deserving of their punishment. And as I say, I've been, working on this for some time. I am proud to consider Ahmed Mansour a friend. I have other friends in Bahrain. Abdul Hadi Al-Awaja, sentenced to life in prison. Nabil Rajab, who has finally been released, but he's under house arrest. These are people who have committed the crime of daring to speak up, daring to call for freedom of expression, of freedom of assembly, daring to challenge these authoritarian ruling regimes. And I think that when we talk about the situation, it is very hard to see a way forward because of the manner in which our governments support these states, be it because of lucrative weapon sales here in the UK, the anxiety to do a free trade deal after we left the European Union, the issue of security against the threat of, Iran, for example, counterterrorism. Of course, many of these states, the UAE, have developed very sophisticated and yet very broad definitions of what constitutes terrorism. Basically, in their eyes, anything that questions authority, you are therefore committing an act of terror. And then these courts, these specialized criminal courts, are used to kangaroo courts, make a mockery of justice, to inflict very hard, harsh sentences on people who have, in many instances, already been tortured. Now, one of the things that we do at Arab Digest, I should have mentioned I'm the editor of Arab Digest. I also spent many years in the Gulf and in the Middle East as a BBC Gulf analyst. One of the things we do is we have podcasts, and the podcast we did this week is with a young man called John Hoffman, and John Hoffman makes a very strong argument. There have been suggestions, quite strong suggestions, that the UAE is going to proceed, the United States rather, is going to proceed to a formal defense pact with the UAE. And John argues that it's damaging on several fronts, not least the human rights front, but also it doesn't do much to serve American interests. And towards that end, I mean, he mentioned to me the Leahy Law. Now, what is the Leahy Law? And I think this is particular to the UAE and every other Gulf state that's inflicting torture and abuse on prisoners of conscience. So forgive me, I'll read it to you. The term Leahy Law refers to two statutory provisions prohibiting the US government from using funds for assistance to units of foreign security forces where there's credible information implicating that unit in the commission of gross violations of human rights, otherwise known by the acronym GVHR. One statutory provision applies to the State Department, the other applies to the Department of Defense. The US government considers torture, extrajudicial killing, enforced disappearance, and rape under color of law as GVHRs, gross violations of human rights, when implementing the Leahy Law. Incidents are examined on a fact-specific basis. Well, all right, let's look at the basis of Ahmed Mansour, who, as I say, I'm proud to consider a friend. And it's on this broader theme of what actually is patriotism. So I'm going to read a little bit of a piece I wrote 3 years ago now for the Middle East Eye. The United Arab Emirates has jailed dozens of activists, including the distinguished Emirati human rights defender Ahmed Mansour, together with members of the Muslim Brotherhood affiliated Islam. Well, let me tell you a little bit about Ahmed, because his story, his life, his great courage mirror all those incarcerated and abused in Middle East jails for having the bravery to peacefully challenge their governments. On 20th of March 2017, Ahmed Mansour was seized from his home and bundled into a 4x4 by men in black balaclavas, taken to an unknown place. His family had no idea where he was, and for a year had virtually no contact with him. He was denied access to a lawyer of his choosing. Nearly a year after he was taken, he was brought to court, sentenced to 10 years in jail, and fined 1 million dirham, that's about $250,000, after being convicted under draconian anti-terror laws and in a grossly unfair trial of, quote, insulting the status and prestige of the UAE and its symbols, including its leaders, and of, quote, seeking to damage the relationship of the UAE with its neighbors by publishing false reports and information on social media. In December 2018, his final appeal was rejected. Now, I remember once years ago on a Skype call, Ahmed joked that he was the last man talking about human rights violations. He pretty much was. Almost every other activist in the MENA region is in jail, in exile, or silenced by the fear of what the authorities will do to them and to their loved ones. And I think it's a very important point that families also pay a very heavy price. Ahmed Mansour and his family have paid that price for his human rights advocacy. Going back to 2011, he had signed a petition calling for democratic and economic reforms. He was subject to an online smear campaign orchestrated by the state security apparatus. It was a campaign that included many death threats. Then in April of that year, he was arrested, held in jail for nearly 8 months, and convicted of insulting the rulers in a trial that made a mockery of justice. However, on 27th of November 2011, Ahmed was sentenced to 3 years in jail. The next day, thanks largely to an international outcry, he and 4 others sentenced with him were pardoned. Just pause there for a minute. That a decade ago, international outcry could actually force these governments to change their minds. That's gone now. That doesn't really affect these governments at all. They behave with great impunity. Now, by the time that Ahmed was released, he'd already lost his job as a senior engineer in a telecommunications firm. Subsequently, the government refused to issue him a certificate of good conduct. Without the certificate, he could not be employed in either the private or public sectors. His bank accounts were frozen. His passport was confiscated. He was banned from travel, a ban which the authorities refused to lift so he could travel to Geneva in 2015 to receive the prestigious Martin Ennals Award for Human Rights Defenders. Despite constant harassment and the ever-present threat of an arrest, Ahmed continued to work with journalists like myself and with international human rights organizations. Now, I asked him once why he persisted in going down a road that would lead again to his incarceration, and he told me the only way to counter repression is by revealing it. And yes, there is always that possibility I will go back to jail, but if we do not talk, who will? And since his arrest, as has already been said, he's been held in solitary confinement, which in itself is considered a torture, an act of torture, in a cell that measures 4 meters square. He has no mattress, his toilet is a hole in the floor. He's denied access to books, and family visits and phone calls are routinely and capriciously denied. He's gone on a hunger strike in protest, and he did halt the strike after authorities allowed his family more access, but regardless, his health is seriously compromised. Now, among his many great attributes, Ahmed Mansour is a fine poet. When I think of him in that dark, cramped cell, I think of this poem. It helps to remind me of his courage and of his fortitude. What are all those stars for? And the night, and the clouds, and the sky erected like a tent in the desert. In a place like this, everything is luxury. Now, Western governments, our own included, have shamefully abandoned the cause of human rights in the Middle East in a tawdry trade-off for weapons sales and lucrative business deals. In the face of egregious and awful abuse, there's a wall of silence, only occasionally punctured by politicians prodded into vague action by human rights organizations in the West. Ahmed Mansour, like all those who have fought tirelessly and have paid dearly for the right to speak freely, is a patriot. He is, to use the Cambridge Dictionary definition, a person who loves their country and, if necessary, will fight for it. The fight for human rights and dignity for all is the true measure of patriotism. And it is also, I should add, the true measure of what democracy is. If we in the West abandon the pillars of our democracy, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, the right to have an opposition, if we abandon those, what does it say about our democracy? I don't want to end on a negative tone. I want to applaud the great fortitude, the great courage, the resilience of all those who are imprisoned and their families and their friends who are paying this enormous price. And we do need to continue to bring pressure on our governments to force them to at least begin the process of acknowledging that democracy begins with human rights. It doesn't end there. That's the start point. Thanks.